Hello, everyone. Welcome to a Climate of Crisis, Human Rights and the Renewable Energy Transition webinar. And thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited for this much needed discussion, particularly because we're at a crucial turning point in this energy transition. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Professor Kathryn Hochstetler, Madhuresh Kumar, Glada, Lahn, and our chair, Lucinda Platt, for making the time to join us tonight. Before I hand it over to Lucinda, who will introduce the speakers in full and go over more of the housekeeping, I'd like to speak a little bit about this webinar on behalf of and as a representative of both the Beacon and the Department of Social Policy Green Impact team. A collaboration between both of these student-led groups, this event is the first of the Green Impact Team speaker series amongst other initiatives, which aims to explore the intersections of environmental and social policy. If you want to keep up to date with our upcoming initiatives, you can follow us on the Department of Social Policy social media accounts, which are on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. This is also the first of the Beacon's events and workshops, which will roll out in the coming months and will be focused on topics like careers in human rights and human rights journalism. So the Beacon is LSE Amnesty International's journalistic arm, which has both an online blog as well as a printed journal published annually at LSE's Houghton Street Press. We will be launching our website and calls for submissions this month, so keep an eye out for that. And if you have any questions about either group or on anything related to this webinar afterwards, feel free to email me. I'm Michaela. I realized I forgot to mention my name. I will include all of this information and more, including my contact info, in an email to you all following this webinar. Now I'll hand it over to Lucinda Platt, our chair for tonight, who is a professor of social policy and sociology in the Department of Social Policy here at LSE, a panel member for the IFS Deaton Inequality Review, and whose own research focuses on the analysis of inequality within and between social groups in the UK and internationally.
Thanks so much, Michaela. Well, it's great to be here. I'm very happy to be chairing this event, which looks absolutely fascinating. Once again, welcome to everybody here and to this event hosted by the Beacon Journal and the Department of Social Policy's Green Impact team. And I'm very delighted to welcome our three panelists. So just to go through them in turn, Professor Kathryn Hochstetler is an expert in the interdisciplinary study of environment and development. She's professor and head of the Department of International Development here at LSE, and she focuses on international environmental negotiations, renewable energy, and environmental policy, primarily in South America. Kathryn is an associate editor of the Journal of Politics in Latin America, and also serves on the editorial boards of Global Environmental Politics and Latin American Politics and Society, among others. So welcome, Kathryn. Turning to Madhuresh. Madhuresh Kumar is an Atlantic Fellow at LSE's International Inequalities Institute, and he's currently serving as national convener of the National Alliance of People's Movements in India. So welcome, and thank you for staying up so late to be part of this. His activism has focused on campaigns and policy advocacy around communities' control over land, water, forest, and minerals. Issues of displacement, energy projects, industrial corridors, and resource mobilization. He co-founded a research advocacy NGO, the India Institute for Critical Action Centre in Movement, which supports initiatives such as alternatives to development. His focuses are climate justice, community organising, land rights, and the politics of inequality. And last but not least, Glada Lahn is a senior research fellow of the Environment and Society programme at Chatham House. She specialises in sustainable energy transitions, pricing and valuation of natural resources, and transboundary water relations in the Middle East and Asia. She's worked on various international resource-related projects focused on the intersection of geopolitics, economics, and development. Glada has led influential research on energy policy in the Arab Gulf, energy access amongst displaced people globally in 2015, and how climate change and decarbonisation affect the prospects and choices for developing country oil and gas producers. Glada is currently focusing on climate impacts and resilience in the MENA region as part of the Cascades.eu project, which studies transboundary climate risks. So these speakers and this event is going to focus on the intersections of renewable energy, environmental justice, and human rights in order to provide a interdisciplinary understanding of the human rights impacts of current transition pathways to a renewable energy and a low carbon economy. So we're looking for lots of discussion. We're going to have our speakers, and then we're hoping for lots of discussion about these issues and how they're linked. The online event is going to be recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to there being no technical difficulties. And of course, there's going to be an opportunity for you to put your questions to all the speakers at the event today. So to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function. Questions will be submitted to myself, and I'll pose as many as we can get through to the speakers. Please do let us know your name and affiliation when you pose your question. And when we're very keen to hear from our students and alumni, so please let us know if you are a student or alumnus or alumna. So without more ado, I'm now going to hand over to Kathryn Hochstetler for the first section of this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucinda, for that very kind introduction. And I'm pleased to be here tonight and to see so many people showing up to hear about human rights and the renewable energy transition. And I hope that we have a good discussion in addition to looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say. So tonight I'm going to be mostly talking about this book that I recently published on political economies of energy transition in Brazil and South Africa. And I'm holding this up so you can see that I very carefully picked this photograph in particular out of many, many photographs of windmills because it has people in it. And I think this is part of then the focus of the comments that I want to make tonight, because I'm going to be particularly focused on the question of how local communities in Brazil and South Africa respond to being the sometimes involuntary hosts of these new infrastructure projects of big wind and solar power installations. And I know that there are a lot of other dimensions of human rights connected to it, but I thought I'll start with that and then can maybe address some of the other ones in the Q&A. But we have some idea about how British people or Canadians respond to having these wind and solar wind power plants, in particular in their communities. They're often resistant to them, but we don't know a lot about how people in the developing world respond to this kind of infrastructure project. So I see my book chapter as filling in a hole. But when I went to read about what we already knew and what we saw in the literature, I found the Brazilian city of Aracati often referenced. And Aracati is a kind of, there are wind farms there, they're in coastal dunes, and in many ways, the story of Aracati is a kind of classic story about the human rights issues connected to having a new wind power installation in your neighborhood. It was very disruptive of local livelihood strategies. And this is a part of Brazil that has the quilombola populations, which are former slave communities that have, because this is very much the Afro-Brazilian region of Brazil, a former sugar slave region, and much of the resistance to the wind power plants then comes out of these communities. But the Aracati community lost their access to a beach, and that meant that they could no longer do the fishing that they relied on for food. They have a whole set of small-scale tourism and other cultural practices that they lost access to because of no longer having access to the beach. So much goes on in Aracati. There were also very significant environmental problems because these windmills were placed in moving dunes that were no longer able to move naturally. And so there was a whole host then of significant human rights and environmental problems that came with this wind farm in Aracati. And I read about other wind farms in the northeastern region of Brazil that had similar kinds of issues. And so I went off to do significant fieldwork then in South Africa, expecting that I would find much the same story. But instead, what I found in South Africa was when I asked about, well, what kinds of contestation had there been around wind and solar farms coming in, people said to me, contestation, there really hasn't been any. And so then I started to puzzle through it and to think about that I needed a better strategy and to look more carefully at what was going on in these host communities. And clearly there were big impacts in Aracati, but Brazil has 600 wind farms. What was happening in those other 599 locations where wind farms were placed? And there's dozens of solar farms there. There's dozens of wind and solar farms in South Africa. And so among other research strategies, I also did field work and talked to local communities and activists, but I underwent a systematic, or I carried out a systematic research strategy of searching on Google on the name of every last one of these wind power plants, and then on the term wind power and solar power and the location where they were. And so I was then reading 10 pages of results to try to see where was their community contestation and over what kinds of issues. And I found local newspaper coverage. I found the Facebook pages of activists. I found blog postings. I found all kinds of things. And interestingly, one of the clear conclusions of this effort then was actually most local communities, not only in South Africa, but also in Brazil, don't openly contest having a wind or solar power plant put into their communities. And this is actually something that I've observed more generally about the study of social movements, which is that we tend to study and focus on the social movements that happen, but we don't necessarily ask our question, well, what about the social movements that didn't happen? What about the other communities that host wind and solar power? What is going on in them? And so the rest of my comments really have to do with trying to puzzle out this question about when and where opposition actually happens and when and where we see significant human rights based objections to having a new renewable energy infrastructure project brought in. In South Africa, I did not find any kinds of mobilizations against grid scale solar, and found open resistance to wind power in just one community, St. Francis Bay. And it was an interesting example of a place where there was opposition to wind power, because in many cases, it looked like northern opposition to wind power, in that it was a middle-class community. They were concerned about the aesthetics of it. They were concerned about the impact on tourism, and there was a very big mobilization around birds and the impact on bird life in the community. So the South African pattern then was really quite different. In Brazil, what I found when I started to look more systematically was that there wasn't any opposition to grid scale solar power, but I did find that in 25% of the cities in Brazil, there was the Aracati pattern, where there were significant local community mobilizations against having a wind power plant put into those communities. And when I looked at the details of why it was that communities mobilized, I saw that in many ways, it really did match the Aracati pattern. For one thing, many of these initial wind power plants were actually placed in genuinely bad environmental locations. So the government had assumed that wind power was just great and there couldn't be a problem with it, and so allowed it to be placed really anywhere. Dunes, national parks, etc. But then the other part of it, the more human rights oriented part of it, was the opposition to wind power plants, or thought differently, the places where wind power plants really did create problems for local communities were locations for communities that had weak formal land claims. So communities that were precarious and communities that might have counted on informal land access were the communities for whom these wind farms were really very disruptive. And these were, for the most part, groups that were already quite marginal economically and socially. They were these former slave communities. They were among the poorest communities in Brazil. And so they really were confronted by quite serious challenges to their livelihood strategies. but it was an interesting pattern then, a real environmental injustice pattern where these already marginal communities were the ones that were also most negatively affected by the arrival of a new wind power plant. Then in the areas where there were no protests, they were quite interesting in Brazil as well, because they tended to be locations that were wealthier, that locations that had more European populations. And when you look at those regions of Brazil, the southern region of Brazil in particular, you find places where there are quite clear land ownership patterns. And so a wind power plant comes in and a farmer is offered a rental contract, and it's all very clean and clear. And those also turned out to be the places in South Africa where wind power farms did not encounter opposition. And so one of the conclusions that I draw out of that is that we tend to focus a lot on this being a new industry, and these are new installations, but in many ways, it's our old familiar inequalities that really shape the way that communities respond to this new technology. And the old experiences of race and social marginality and things like that also affect which communities are negatively impacted by this new industry. So it's in some ways an old story for a new industry. But the other final point that I wanted to make too is that, and this is true not just for this location issue, but I think for renewable energy generally, is because it is a new industry, we are seeing new impacts. And so we're focusing a lot on the new impacts of wind and solar power and other parts of the renewable energy supply chain. But the thing is, there are huge rights violations, major population displacements associated with hydropower in Brazil. And the coal industry in South Africa, which is the traditional source of electricity in South Africa, is a place where there are generations of environmental blights. There are serious health problems for the communities there. And so one of the questions that I always want to pose when we start to look at the human rights impacts of renewable energy is to say, well, let's not forget about the human rights impacts of the energy that we're transitioning from, because large hydropower, coal power, oil drilling, these are also really high impact kinds of projects. And so I worry a little bit that we'll lose some of the beneficial aspects of renewable energy by just focusing on the new human rights violations associated with them without being fully focused on the way that other forms of electricity and infrastructure projects also carry their own costs. And unfortunately, in some ways, we end up trying to weigh then different patterns of human rights violations. The human rights violations that displace indigenous populations in the Brazilian Amazon versus the human rights violations associated with a new wind power plant in the Afro-Brazilian areas of a different part of Brazil. And I think we often then end up with really difficult quandaries about thinking about how to address human rights impacts. So as I say, there's a lot more that I could say, but I'll stop there, and hopefully the questions will bring out some other issues.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and I think lots of things we can discuss there. But before we do, I'm going to move on to Madhuresh Kumar. So over to you. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and to share my opinion, and I think experiences from the activism around the questions of land, forest, and other resources. And I think when I received the notice about this invitation, I received the invitation about this meeting. And then I thought about in 2006, India came up with National Energy Plan, National Electricity Plan. And there the government of India made an estimation that by 2030, they would like to have 800 gigawatts of power. At that time, we were at 250 gigawatts. And we were like, okay, and then immediately by next 2 years, we organized. And we said, we knew that what does it mean for, if you are looking at 800,000 megawatts, what does it mean for communities? Because we immediately knew that that's the time it will cause a lot of displacement because thermal power plants, huge thermal power plants, they require land, but not associated with that is the whole infrastructure around transmission, then mining, where will the coal come from and all of that. We started organizing around. At the same time, we had something called roughly 500 or 600 special economic zones which were proposed. So our hands were full. We were already coming from anti-dam. My first association is with an anti-dam movement. And we started organizing and we led a lot of battles. And finally, I think roughly 100 SEZs were sanctioned, and rest 500 or whatever number were, that was canceled. And some major ones were canceled, like 10,000 hectares of one SEZ. So 10,000 hectares, that's a huge amount of land. 100 square kilometer we are talking about. And we had a number of those. Same way in the thermal power plants, with thermal power plants, 500 megawatt, 1000 megawatt, but that was not enough. Government came up with ultra mega thermal power plants. And then which was like 4,000 megawatts, 5,000 megawatts. And that's the scale we are talking about. And why I'm saying this, because we had to fight against those. And over a period of time, in 2006, since the National Electricity Plan came, and with that, anybody, even a newspaper, which had no experience of building thermal power plants, they all got the contract for it. So Dainik Bhaskar, one of the biggest newspapers, they got a contract to build a thermal power plant. And randomly, anybody who applied, you got a contract. And so over a period of time, many of 500 gigawatt capacity, which was at different stages of development, they all got canceled, shelved, too much opposition from people and all of that. At that time, 2006, it was 250 gigawatts of installed capacity. Today, it's 400 gigawatts. That's where we stand. So in a period of 16 years, that's the progress we have made. But still the target remains that 800 gigawatts will be there. That's what the government is looking at. Now, with the whole conversation around renewable power, and rightly so, we need to talk about it. So the government of India recently, in last 2 years, said that by 2030, India will build 450 gigawatts of solar power. So not solar, renewables. So they will add 450 gigawatts in next 8 years. So it's like 2022. So in this one decade, they will add, today I think roughly we are around 100 gigawatts. So another 350 gigawatts they have to add. Now, of course, it cannot be decentralized. We cannot produce decentralized electricity at such a huge scale. So what are they doing? They are adopting the same playbook, which is ultra mega solar power plant. And now just to give a case, like what is the scale we are talking about? So there is one so a couple of examples. So there is one in Rewa, which Madhya Pradesh in the central part of India, where they said that this broke record for like the minimum 4 rupee per unit of electricity, which is like, I don't know, like some cents. That's the minimum. So it's a very cheap. It made records, it made news, and there is huge investment. But it's 750 megawatts. The land requirement is 1,590 acres. But 1,590 acres, so that's one. There is another one, which one is about Pavagada. It's in the state of Karnataka, in the tech city, Bangalore. It's near 3 hours drive from there. And it's next to a science city and academic city, which is coming up. This, and the size of it, it's on, so it's a 2,050 megawatt project. And the size is 13,000 acres. If you convert it into hectares, it's 5,200 hectares. And to just give a context, City of London, which is not the big metropolis, but your 1 square mile. So it's 2.9 square kilometer. Central business district is 2.9 square kilometer. This solar field we are talking about is 52 square kilometer. So think about it, just the scale of it. So as much as you can look, that's where. And it's not that it was empty land. It's not an empty land. Communities live there. Justification is that this is a place which is empty. It's a barren land. It's grazing land and all. But nothing is barren. We are a country of 1.3 billion people. So no place is barren. So there are people who are living there. There are shepherd communities who have their traditional livelihood coming out of there. And this is only one part of it. Around that, there is a now defense installment which has come in, the science city, which is science education city, which is being built. So this is a huge area. And all the people, where do they go? There's some of them who were not moved. They are living between like different solar panels. So that's the tragedy we are talking about. Conflicts. And there is one a struggle which is going on. It's in the state of Assam, which is in the northeast of India. So there, and people say that the small event, so I'm talking about the big, think of the small ones. People say that, no, we can do a small, let's do a small one. So there is a 15 megawatt solar park. Now this 15 megawatt, that requires some 93 acres. It may sound small, but in 93 acres, there is, and one of the world's famous Azure Power, that's a big one. They are the ones who are developing it. And there has been contestation, conflict from there. People have been resisting for more than a year now because their land, fertile land, was taken forcibly from them. What does it show? One thing which we have been saying all this while as activists, that look, development, whenever you say development, for communities, it means destruction. And one of the slogans we have been saying is, Vikas chahiye, vinash nahi, which is we want development, not destruction. And this is what, because our experience with development processes in the country shows that that development for somebody else at cost of somebody else. And there is no justice in it. Because there is if we have to look in since 1947, there is concept of historical justice, then so many people have lost their land, livelihood, everything. And you are bringing new things in the name of what? That will provide green jobs. Our argument is people who are dependent on natural resources, they already have a green job. They don't need another green job. They already have one. You are destroying that green job. So you should be counting them as jobs lost. And then how many jobs did you create? We all know how many jobs a solar power plant creates or whatever. So, and some of the things we said, it's about, if any lesson we have learned as a community, then we need to focus on what did we learn. So here, we said free, prior, informed consent. We said development planning. Who plans the development? And I think this question remains for the renewable energy as well. Do we really need that much of electricity? And it comes at what cost and who pays for it? If you are so interested in having a solar park, let's put it in the presidential palace in the heart of the city. It's a huge area. President lives, he's a single person. So put that there. Why not put there? Why does it has to go into a village there somewhere? And then the worst of it, the fact that they said it's renewable, it's low carbon. So then a project of a scale of 52 square kilometers says it does not require environmental impact assessment. So it does not require environmental clearance. And what does the environmental impact assessment include? Not only impact on environment, but also social impact assessment. So what will be the loss of livelihood and everything? And so all these projects get just pushed. And you have then, of course, they say we are negotiating directly with the farmers. So then at 28 years, after 28 years, farmers will get the land back. It never happens. We all know the story that after 28 years, a land which has been barren for 28 years, what will farmers do there? So I think the land also degrades. I think there are a lot of questions. I just have one slide just to show that what does it mean. I know time is up, so just last. Here. This is the land conflict around renewable power development in India. There is a Land Conflict Watch. It's a good website if anybody is looking at. It tracks very sector-wise and everything, all the land conflict in India. So it records 6 ongoing, but there are many more. This is not complete. But 2,836 people affected. That's the official number, but there are many more people who have been affected by this. And 6,274 hectares. But this is, as I said, very limited because even one project which I talked about, Pavagada, which is somewhere here. So that one has itself 5,200 hectares. But the second, what is that we are asking? So if at any question, if the transition has to happen, the justice has to be the center of it. We cannot have We cannot use the same principle through which we ran extractive economy on the left, and we use the same principle to have a regenerative economy. We cannot have it because they don't match. There is an extractive economy, and we are using the same principles to do the transitional just transition. The last point I want to make is, I think for us as a community, and I think for everybody, this is about shifting power. Unless we shift power from what it is today, any of the process, what we are thinking of building a new society or a new economy and everything, things will not change. And we will continue to have the inequity, and we will continue to have the conflicts, because the last 30, 40 years of globalization and what has shown us that it has only increased inequity in the society. So any further transitional economy, if we are going to build, or the low carbon economy, whatever you want to call it, unless it changes things fundamentally at the center of it, the way we think and approach it, it won't happen. I know we are in a rush, because I'm not talking about rush here, but as a civilization, we are in a rush. We are thinking that Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees centigrade, we have to really reach somewhere. But we can, if we do it in a rushed way, it will further lead to conflict, and it will further lead to more contestation. So I think as a society, we have to make a choice, which means, which everybody has been saying, and I think in Europe it is said very differently, in a degrowth concept, the concept of degrowth. But I think otherwise, we need to fundamentally rethink, do we need the kind of development which we have achieved and the way we have developed until now? Thank you very much. I think more points we can cover during our conversation. Thank you.
That was, yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Say lots of thoughts raised there and things I think we can go on to discuss. But before we do that, I'm going to turn to Glada Lahn, who's now going to speak to us. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucinda, and thank you, Kathryn and Madhuresh, for such a fascinating presentations. I'm very, very interested in the work that you're doing, and I come from it from a bit of a different perspective, having worked on fossil fuel side of things for many years now. And I suppose I would start with the reminder that, you know, our energy systems rely on fossil fuels for about 84% of the traded energy that we use, and that they're responsible for around 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So they're a big part of the picture when it comes to reaching our climate goals, which are exceedingly urgent. Many of you will have seen the IPCC's report that came out this week. So yes, to go back to Kathryn's point, fossil fuels haven't been that great at securing human rights. I think they very much play into what Madhuresh was talking about in terms of fueling certain power dynamics. And certainly you can look at the history of oil and gas, for example, and see its interactions with colonialism, with imperialism, going back to the 1950s, the US and UK backed coup, which brought down the Prime Minister of Iran in 1953, was very much linked to his decision to nationalize the oil sector and kick the foreign oil companies out. And you've seen that replayed in many ways during the 50s, 60s, 70s in countries that had mineral resources that were controlled by foreign powers. More recently, you know, you can point to the violent efforts to clear land, for example, in South Sudan in the 80s and 90s that then led to war. The human rights abuses in the Niger Delta, which are very, very well known, when the Ogoni people were trying to get justice for the destruction in their lands, and the destruction that was caused by the water pollution in the Ecuadorian Amazon, which has led to many, many health problems, a lot of cancers and so on in that region. And of course, you've also got this impact that dependence on hydrocarbon exports has tended impacts that dependence has had on democracy and on freedom of speech, given that is a central revenue which flows to usually to governments, which they can then use it to control and give out to the network. So all that's fairly well known, and I just wanted to mention that first of all. Now, when we turn to what's happening now, on the one hand, human rights is being raised as in legal cases brought by NGOs and even by groups of children, pushing governments and companies to do more on climate change, given their various obligations on human rights. And there were some very prominent cases recently in the Netherlands, both taken against the Netherlands government and Shell. There's been quite a few cases in the global south focusing on socioeconomic rights. And then in terms of the transition to renewables, I think Madhuresh and Kathryn have covered those issues really well, but I just wanted to draw attention to the issue of supply chains. So we are seeing more reports about the minerals and the manufactured products that go into our solar panels, into our EV batteries. For instance, electric vehicles rely on batteries that require cobalt. Most of that is produced in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and there you have really severe human rights abuses, child labor, and so on. And those supply chains are very much of concern. Same with polysilicon, which is an input to PV panels, and the allegations of forced labor in the Uyghur region of China. So those are starting to, those issues are starting to arise, and consumers are obviously concerned about them. Now, the third issue that I wanted to really focus on and see, and I'd be interested to hear what questions you have about it, is the actual shift away from fossil fuels for the countries that are most dependent on them. So what does dependence mean? Well, we can look at it in different ways. We can think about, what proportion of GDP, for instance, depends on the export of oil, coal, or gas, and that gives you a bit of an idea of how diversified the economy is. You can look at as a percentage of government spending, and in that respect, you've got countries like Iraq, Equatorial Guinea, South Sudan, who are all way more than 60% dependent for government spending on those revenues. So there's a lot of countries like that that have a lot to lose from a transition whereby the price of their main export declines. You can also think about, the price that they require, and there's been some studies done recently to look at the countries that will be most vulnerable, and they would include those countries mentioned: Timor-Leste, Angola, Azerbaijan, for instance. There would be quite a substantial group of countries, and therefore peoples, who would essentially lose out with a very rapid fall in those revenues. That's not happening at the moment, and I think what you'll see is a lot of volatility before it declines, and volatility is also a problem for these economies. So what effect will that have on people? I think in the coal regions, there's a lot of discussion around jobs, because coal employs a lot of people. So what happens in those communities? You can see like communities like Appalachia in the US talking about this a lot. What is the route for just transition, green transition for those communities? And that's, so labor and labor rights are a big issue. Oil and gas is a bit different, because there's many less employment in the actual industries, and a lot of it are skilled expatriates in developing countries. So one of the bigger questions is the spending, and so that includes civil service jobs and the way that the government spends on welfare or subsidies. Where would the cuts happen? And you see with the COVID crisis, when the price of oil and gas tumbles, then governments are forced into debt. They have to make cuts, domestically, and reforms which tend to hurt the poorest most if they're not done very efficiently. And I guess on the actual issue of what's being done on just transition, there's a whole raft of initiatives. Some of them were discussed at COP26. Certainly the International Labour Organization and the various multilateral development banks are developing packages whereby they work with countries to assist in, so while they're pulling investment out of fossil fuels, that they're trying to put it into new sectors of the economy, which are supposed to stimulate green jobs and help workers to reskill and transition. I guess I'm happy to talk more about those, but I'm really happy to learn what questions people have, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Again, really, really interesting points you raised. And we've got a bit of time before we move to questions for some discussion among the panel. So do carry on putting your questions in the Q&A box. I've seen people already start, and meanwhile we've had discussions. I was just pulling a couple of things out from what you were talking about. Between you, one of those issues that I think both you, Glada, and Kathryn, you raised was this idea of counterfactuals, but from rather different ends. So the counterfactual of the human rights violations in one case that are already existing with fossil fuels, and that by talking about renewables, we shouldn't forget that. And on the other hand, in a sense, the counterfactual of this move away from fossil fuels. What does that mean actually for local communities who are dependent on that? So I wondered if maybe you could comment on that. And the other thing I was putting out, which was brought out by Madhuresh, and also again by Kathy, was this question of under what conditions do conflicts and contestation arise, and that Kathryn was noting that there was quite a lot of cases where it didn't arise, whereas Madhuresh was highlighting that there was a lot of contestation. And so whether that gives us any kind of insight into the factors that are driving that, and whether it's the vision, the top-down vision, that's sort of promoted by the fact that there are lots of people arguing for this rapid attention to the climate crisis, or whether there's something going on about how much people are involved or not. And as is noted, is that because the people who are more powerful get to say where solar farms or wind turbines get placed? So they were just my initial thoughts. I wondered, and anything else you want to comment on each other's, I wondered if I could hand over to you to discuss either of those points or any others. Who'd like to chip in? Kathy?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in. I think, maybe I'll just pick up on the question that I had already started to talk about, which is this whole question of what drives this? When does it become contestation? When doesn't it? But picking up on the specific question that you asked Lucinda about how do the decisions get made to have this renewable energy in the first place? And I think Glada talked about it from a perspective that many people have, which is that, there's a kind of urgency connected to these new forms of electricity that's connected to climate change. And it kind of creates, a dilemma in many cases, which is that you have this activity that is good for one purpose, which is really important, and then problematic for other purposes, which are really important. And so this is, to me, a topic that just really, really, raises these questions of trade-offs that are really hard. And, and then just picking up on another line of the questioning, well, where does this decision then to build wind and solar power or renewable energies come from? One of the lessons of my book is that, at least in the Brazilian and South African cases, it's actually not, it's only partially driven by climate. And these questions about location are actually really peripheral. And that when you look at my book, what are the things that really drive the introduction of this? Well, first of all, the really stupendous drop in global prices that suddenly make this one of the cheaper forms of electricity, especially wind power around the world. But then the other thing that becomes very important is something that has come up only tangentially is both Brazil and South Africa end up being really interested in wind and solar power because they think they can build an industry on it. They can have a whole industrial policy. I think India also has these motivations a lot. So when you go to look at why are countries building wind and solar power, in the case of Brazil and South Africa, it's because of their industrial policy ambitions, their economic ambitions. They think it's going to produce good jobs. It doesn't necessarily, but they think it's going to. And so, it's an interesting phenomenon then, because like in my view of the issue, even though climate is one of the things that makes people very interested in it, that in fact, many governments are actually driven by the economic dimensions of it. And for good or for bad, that's where I see at least Brazil and South Africa. And from what I know of India, that's much of the dynamic as well.
Yes, I think that woke up. Glada, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just really wanted to follow on from what Kathryn said, in the sense that I think you see governments going for the same kind of things that they're used to, the big, sexy, centralized, big projects, the projects that can involve kickbacks, the projects that make a big splash in the news, and actually, I think as Madhuresh touched on, the energy transition is about much more than that. In fact, you won't meet your renewable energy targets if you don't do efficiency, and doing efficiency has a much greater potential actually for new jobs. The issues of retrofitting buildings, of much better construction, that is both safer and more in harmony with the environment, of water infrastructure, of regenerative agriculture and urban planning. I mean, there's a whole raft of initiatives that need to go together with a much more holistic approach to social well-being at the same time. And I think governments can see that as very difficult, right? So they go for the big projects first, which may have very disruptive social impact. So I just wanted to say that the energy transition definitely isn't all about renewable energy. And actually, yeah, there's other things. I mean, I did a lot of work with the Gulf countries, for example, who use a tremendous amount of their own oil and gas domestically, which is also unsustainable for their economies. And the gains that they could get from, simple things like maintaining their air conditioners, changing a few things about buildings, setting regulations, all the stuff that doesn't get a lot of publicity was immense, huge amount of savings from efficiency. Yeah, and I guess, actually I'll stop there.
May I add a few things?
Yes, I was going to say, did you want to come in on that, particularly in relation to, sort of also bringing it back to this human rights issue as well, but sort of the patterns of these patterns of displacement that we're seeing because of pursuing sort of glossy projects and so on, is that inevitable, or is there some way of shifting that? But carry on, you wanted to make some comments.
Just saying that I think, yes, the decisions are being made at the top, and they have other motives and other drivers just then. And I think one of the arguments we have been making as a movement, and I think what we are saying that, look, we are not opposed to the renewable development because that's the way we have to go. We cannot continue to depend on the fossil fuels. The point is, how do we do it? And I think that's at the heart of it. If we do it the wrong way, it will produce the same results in the society. So it's not going to solve our problem. Rather, it's going to continue to add to the problem. So one of the demands we made when we were saying that no more thermal power plants or whatever. So we put an extreme demand and we said, no forced land acquisition at all. And the argument we gave is that, look, and I think this is the question also relates to the Amanda has asked, that, look, governments have already been acquiring land over a period of time. And they are, at least in Indian case, and I know in many of the other developing countries, this is what happened. You acquire land in the name of industrialization. Now, so what we did in India, that when we were campaigning on the SEZs and the thermal power plants, we said, okay, we filed the Right to Information Act under applications for information with the government. And we said, tell us how much land you have acquired till date, and then how much of it you have used. Because government acquires 100 acres and then you divide it as small parcels of land to different industries. Many of them have become defunct. So all that land is unutilized. And then they already have at least 50% of the land, they're sitting on it as part of their land bank. So I'm saying you already have so much land, but you're not willing to use that land. Rather, you want to acquire more and more land just in order to fuel a certain kind of conflict. Just doesn't make sense. So we said no forced land acquisitions, that put a halt to it. And I think if we have to put a demand again on this particular issue of land acquisition for big solar parks or even anything, our argument is you have built these dams and created huge reservoirs, use them. You have created you have these railway stations, you have the gigantic infrastructure, huge airports. Why don't you use those rooftops? You have built stadiums across the country. So there is so much of land which is out there, but it's a lazy way of doing development, where it's easy. Okay, you have these poor people, you have these people who are like indigenous people whose land titles are contested or like not very solid in the legal sense. So you can just kick them out. And I think that's a lazy way of doing development. And I think it boils down to that. You're not interested in changing the system. You're just interested in perpetuating the power of the elite. So I think that's I think crux is there. Because ultimately, if you look, the transition is driving industry. And if you look world over, it's the same guys who were earlier into fossil fuels. They have all moved to the renewables. So in India, Adani and Reliance, these two big corporations who are all doing fossil fuels, now they're all the biggest solar power proponent. And then people will say, yes, well, what is the problem? Our problem is corporations, unless and until we question the power of big corporations, that when corporations rule the world, I think that debate we have put somewhere on the side. But I think these five GAF, Google, Alphabet, Apple, and Facebook and Amazon, these five tech giants, they're ruling the world today. And they are driving a lot of it. So corporations are a problem. And we cannot, unless we address those questions of power, justice won't happen. So we will not have transition and equity, which we are looking for.
Thank you. Yes, and that picks up on some of the points I think that were being made by Kathryn about that this is about a development of an industry as much as it's about climate change, and perhaps we can sometimes sort of conflate lots of different interests when we're talking about these issues, or seeing one as being kind of somehow more virtuous than others. I'm aware that there are people wanting to ask questions. I wondered if anybody else wanted to come back on those, on any of those points, or anything raised by each other before I move to the questions. Do you want to pick up on any of each other's comments or not? I'm not seeing any great enthusiasm, so I'll move to the questions then. So we have a question from Amanda Young, who's the Atlantic. Okay, so it's just disappeared from the questions, but I'm assuming she still wants to answer it. Okay. Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the LSE is in Melbourne, Australia. So she's listening in at 5 a.m. So that's keen. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us. So she's looking about considering displacement by solar in context, saying in Australia, Indigenous communities have a precarious land tenure called native title, which can be overridden fairly easily. Solar is a new technology with an old story, the latest round of colonisation in our 230 plus year history, and huge tracts of Indigenous land is where the sun shines. And so she's asking, what advice do you have for proponents of solar tech to engage with precarious Indigenous people and create a just transition? So So I think, yeah, so the question there about how do you take advantage of that sun without sort of disempowering or depriving people of their land title. Kathryn would come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Madhuresh did start to answer this question, but let me just come in because I was thinking of some things when he said them, and now I can respond to him and Amanda together. I mean, I do think it's important. One of the things that we need to keep in mind with something like wind and solar power is that when they are done in big grid scale installations, they take a lot of land. And that's different because the fossil fuel plants and even hydroelectric plants, well, it depends on the size of the reservoir, but they don't have the same kinds of land requirements. So this is simply a kind of electricity that is not as dense, and so does occupy more land. But I really think, I mean, it depends on the country you're in, but certainly when you're in a country of the size of Australia or a country of the size of Brazil or South Africa or India, you don't have to put the wind and solar installations in places where there are really sharp conflicts with local, indigenous groups that have, important land rights. You can choose to put the wind and solar power other places. And I think the various kinds of examples that Madhuresh was mentioning that are really waste areas, so to speak, I mean, these are places where it totally makes sense to put wind and solar installations, solar power in particular, to put it over parking lots or to put it on top of malls and other kinds of shopping centers. I mean, these are the places where it's I think obvious that we should be doing it. And then those are also the kinds of locations that reduce the need for the kinds of transmission lines that otherwise also create a whole new set of land conflicts. Put the solar panels where the people are. And I mean, I think one initiative that South Africa has been doing that's a kind of interesting way of thinking also about some of this location issue is that South Africa is putting wind and solar installations in its old coal communities. So the transmission infrastructure is already there in many cases. It can be adapted for wind and solar power. You don't have to sort of clear new land, and it brings, especially if there are payments that go to local communities, it brings an alternative kind of resource to that region that already has been hosting coal plants. So I think there are ways of being, as Madhuresh said, you can be smart about where you put wind and solar power. You don't have to put it, but as he said, the temptation for governments is to put it in the quick place, which is in many ways the places where people are more vulnerable. They have less clear land claims. You don't have to pay them the same way that you have to pay more formal landowners. But I think that that's a pretty obvious kind of approach to this issue, which is that we need to have systems of locating these plants that are really sensitive to these other claims on the land.
Thanks very much. Did anybody else want to come in that? I was just thinking that also trying with Dave's point about how the costs to people who when coal mining goes of those communities, that this is one way of thinking about adapting those sites where there's a lot of employment needed as coal goes. So yes, and also it seems it was very much struck me when Madhuresh was speaking how that putting something in the middle of nowhere, then you do have these huge transmission costs where there aren't many people there to benefit from it without it traveling. So really interesting. Thank you. I'll move to Anil T. Varghese, who asks, how will one address the question of dispossession of land, be it commons or private lands where community reside? Who has to bear the brunt of this in the name of green or renewables? So I think this is a very related question, but I wondered whether anybody wanted to add anything to that answer that's already been given, or do you feel you've already addressed that? I think Madhuresh's answer was you shouldn't be dispossessing. Is that right?
Yes, in fact, as I said, meaning by there are different ways of doing it. You just have to have the political will. I think it's a question of political will, that if the governments want to do that and they want to respect their own laws, I think the point is that they are trying to change the law so that it becomes easy for them acquire more land. So it's a planned displacement. There is no other way to put it. They are just planning that they don't care for people. And I think it's very true in many countries. There's a related question asked by Martin, that if there are, regardless of development level, if in the Europe or in the other developed nation, these kind of problems are there. I'm not very aware of it, but I think Australia falls into that category, that in Australia there is problem. In US also, I'm aware of the fact that there are questions and problems around the solar development. Same in some European countries around the windmills, there have been conflict because of the community, because of the noise it makes and other issues. I'm not able to pinpoint exact places, but there are those examples in Europe as well. I think maybe Glada, if you have more information on that question. And yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Great. So I'll move on to Gabriella's question then. She's a PhD student in LSE anthropology, and she's got a question for Kathryn. So how do you see ideas like exporting green hydrogen as driving a production much beyond national needs in global South countries?
I know it was addressed to me, but I was actually hoping that Glada would answer it, because I really haven't looked at the issue of green hydrogen. I mean, I would, and I'm not even sure really how I would start to answer that question, except to say that, you know, in my view, and again, I'm happy to listen to anybody who knows more about this topic than I do. In my view, we're still quite a long way away from having green hydrogen, much less being in a position where it drives some kind of regional energy grid or energy exchange. So, but again, it's really, despite it being addressed to me, it's really not an issue that I've been looking at this point. So I don't know if Glada, you have been looking at green hydrogen, or there we go, Madhuresh has been.
No, but Glada, go ahead, talk about it, then I can add. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that much. I mean, I'd agree that it seems like quite a way off, green hydrogen, just to explain to people, is hydrogen created from renewable energy rather than from, say, gas, which can create hydrogen at the moment, but you've still got the emissions, or you can do gas with carbon capture and storage and sort of reduce those a bit. But or you have this plan for some countries now, especially the big oil exporters, of moving from hydrogen created from fossil fuels to hydrogen created from renewables. So of course you've got the similar issues with the actual renewables producing them. There's some Sahel countries who want to do this. Actually, Mauritania is one of them that has plans for green hydrogen. It's, you know, it's quite a high-tech industry. What you might see is more ammonia to hydrogen production, which then involves potentially, you know, it involves the shipping of it, which in some cases might involve ports, you know, so there will be infrastructure involved, pipelines involved, all that takes up land. So no, it's not something I've looked at, but there would be the things I've been looking at. And just to note that there is a lot of money and interest going into it right now. So wherever there's a lot of money being poured in, it's something to watch, you know, there's development to watch.
Yeah, very quickly to add to that, I think, so hydrogen debate, it's still shaping up. Green hydrogen is I think at the end of the overall spectrum of the hydrogen development, because that's the least developed. But then fossil fuel industry is already at it, because they want to use it as an escape hatch, where they are saying that we will do hydrogen, and that's really good way of continuing to do fossil fuel. So like the gas industry. So who are the leaders who are investing in it? In India, India is looking at it and developing a big way. So Adani and Reliance, who own big refineries, oil refineries, they are trying to work around it. Middle East countries who already have oil and gas reserves, they are trying to work on it. Similarly, there are a number of others. The point is, they will say that the CCS, carbon capture and storage, that's really nice, and it will give them carbon credit, it will give them finance. They can get some subsidies also in the name of that. But we all know it's the same situation about 5%, that's all it can do. It's not a proven technology. There is one plant in Canada which exists at the moment. So it's not that something which has been proven, but industry is already making an argument so that they can continue to function in the same way rather than having to switch to the renewables in a quick time. So that's there. And I think I would put that not the green hydrogen per se, but the rest of the hydrogen, because they're using the green hydrogen to push for the other kind of hydrogen coming out of the fossil fuel, that it comes under the question of the false solutions. That there's a lot of false solution, which is going clean coal. We will, in the plastics, that we will recycle plastics. No, you are only able to recycle 5% of plastic, that's all. But they want to, the industry uses some of these language to push for the low carbon and all the rest. But we can't expect Coca-Cola to lead our just transition. It's plain and simple.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. So we have one from Akila Ranganathan, asking, is it possible to meet our renewable energy goals and needs without requiring large mega energy projects? Can we use smaller, decentralized, collectively, individually owned projects? So I know, Glada, you were talking about the importance of efficiencies, but I think this also relates to kind of who has control. Kathryn, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that is really interesting, especially in the South African context. And it raises some rather interesting dimensions of it. But I think one of the things that's worth pointing out is that we have, in fact, mostly been talking about grid scale to this point, and that one of the main appeals of grid scale, especially in developing countries, is that it has so far been a substantially cheaper way of building out the grid when you have large numbers of people that need to have electricity, or you need to have large amounts of electricity built out. Grid scale is, it's scale. So when Brazil was wanting to go about reaching parts of the population that didn't yet have electricity access, it was much cheaper and faster for it to build out that element of it. But then the South African case then is one where I think it shows some of the interesting ambiguities about looking for some of the smaller decentralized projects in that context. And, again, you go back to the history. So what's the history of electricity in South Africa? The history of electricity in South Africa is the apartheid government would not build electricity for Black people. And so when it left office in 1994, Black South Africans almost across the board did not have access to electricity. So that's 70% of the country that did not have electricity. So the South African government in real time has been trying to figure out how to get electricity to that 70% of its Black population. And it's now gotten about 80% of its population total on the grid, but there's another 20% that's not served. And so one of the options that the South African government is saying is, all right, the way that we're going to reach that last 20% is we're going to do it with smaller decentralized electricity projects. But what they think that they can afford to do is they think that they can afford to give people an electricity service that basically provides them with a couple of hours of electricity in the evening, enough to run a cell phone, charge a cell phone, run lights for a couple of hours, and run a TV or a radio for a couple of hours in the evening. And so there's actually been quite a big mobilization in South Africa against this renewable energy program, because they say this is energy injustice. I mean, we wouldn't live with that kind of electricity provision. We couldn't be participating in this webinar on that kind of electricity provision. So South Africans say they don't want that off-grid. They want to wait for the grid. So then you might say, well, why not then give them what's available to, say, a consumer in the US or the UK, where they can buy these grid systems, these off-grid systems, and power their household and have enough electricity to run refrigerators and computers and the things that we value. Well, then you run into the problem that the upfront costs of those are very significant. So in general, renewable energy costs a lot to build, and then it's essentially free to run. Well, governments and banks may be able to make those 20-year calculations, but for the 20% of South Africans who do not yet have electricity, they don't have the funds to pay £20,000 for an electricity system that would give them really high quality electricity, because they can't wait 20 years for that to be paid off. They don't have those sums of money now. So finance becomes a very big barrier for developing countries for having off-grid, small scale renewable energy. And so then you get a really, really problematic dynamic in South Africa. So who is doing smaller, decentralized, individually owned solar projects in South Africa? Well, it's wealthy consumers who think that the public provision is too expensive and unreliable and not high quality enough, and they can afford to put these systems on their houses. But it makes it even worse for the overall electricity system, because those are the paying customers of the current electricity. And if they opt off the grid in order to have their own household level electricity, it means that the electricity system has that much less money to bring the poor consumers who are not yet on the grid. And so what household level electricity in a country like South Africa becomes the wealthier consumers having private sources of electricity, just like they have private education and private security and private transport. But it's not the same kind of solution that it might appear otherwise. And it's and I think maybe the obvious solution is to have, maybe governments provide more electricity through these small systems, but the problem is that when there's not a lot of money in the electricity system, those upfront costs for wind and solar power make these kinds of decentralized systems really prohibitive at this point in many developing countries. So it becomes, again, a new kind of injustice, this one related to energy access and energy cost.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Glada, you wanted to come in and add something to that?
Yes, I thought that was fascinating, Kathryn, and definitely touches on a problem that a lot of developing countries, I think, and some of the richer countries are facing in terms of, in fact, all countries are facing in terms of getting the business model and the incentives right for this new energy system that we're going to be creating, because greater efficiency, more rooftop solar, for instance, doesn't necessarily, it doesn't meet the traditional need for revenues for the utilities. For example, the utilities are not getting the revenue they need to invest, and then you have the power providers themselves, who might lose out because their contracts are not honored. So that's a big problem for bankability in many African countries, for example. There's a lot I could say on that, but I was also thinking that a problem for many countries as well is they're locked into existing fossil fuel power contracts, where they have to keep buying that thermal power as well. So what they're seeing is sometimes a surplus of renewables on the grid, and sort of halting renewable energy for that reason. The other thing I wanted to touch on was just going back to the question, not that I can answer the question about whether we can do without mega projects, because every time that someone tries to model what the energy system looks like in a world where we actually meet our 1.5 degrees Celsius sort of limit, they run into huge difficulties. To be honest, it's really, really difficult to imagine that scenario. And the IEA's done it, several others have done it, and they're immediately criticized. And they do include CCS, they do include mega projects, and usually quite a bit of gas as well. And so one thing I want to say is that it is hard to model, and maybe that involves, without seeing sort of everything, every option that we can imagine. But on the other hand, maybe we are in the wrong mindset. We still have a very supply side mindset for energy, and there's this fixation with providing more. And you'll see this often used as an argument from the fossil fuel companies that we can't solve energy poverty unless we have a lot more energy. But what about a massive reduction in the use of energy from rich consumers, for instance? I'm not talking in terms of exactly what we use in our houses, but what we actually consume and needs to be produced elsewhere. Obviously, there's ramifications for degrowth that Madhuresh mentioned, but there's a lot of interesting discussions on a shift towards well-being and what that means. Because we actually cannot continue to rely on an economy that constantly promotes growth through production and consumption using resource throughput and eventually burning or landfill, for example. So the shift to a more circular regenerative economy and well-being are very interesting aspects of this, which have to be linked to energy transition. So I would just sort of leave there and maybe say that there's some really interesting projects here in the UK and other places where lower income groups, for instance, who live in local authority council housing, have managed to acquire solar panels to reduce their electricity bills. But where a company still benefits, but they also share in that benefit. There's quite a lot of interesting projects like that, which can help us manage the rising costs of fossil fuel electricity.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for this one more question, and we've got one more question here. So I'd like to put this one to you. So this is from an anonymous attendee asking about the situation in Ireland. So in regards to the just transition, when reviewing the situation in Ireland, where bog and peatlands are no longer being used as a source of fossil fuels due to their ability to be carbon sinks. It's not necessarily displacing the community due to the input of renewable energy sources on the land, but the closure of these lands sees the dispossession of the culture, livelihoods, and identities, which are all intrinsically linked to the landscape. How can this transition be just when one's identity and heritage is being erased in place of a carbon sink and the government's carbon quotas? So raising that's quite a complex issue there that's being raised for the last question. So I wondered who would like to have a go at responding to that. Madhuresh, can I ask you to?
Yeah, I think, yes, I was going to say it's related to, if I understand the question correctly, it's related to the other question as well. And I think that's where I wanted to add to this question that very simple answer to this, yes, this is not a just transition. If you are displacing people and their culture, so that's a simple answer. But I think the question is more about whether we really need, can everything be met with the decentralized form of energy? And can that be also, do we need really big projects as well? And I think I'm glad, Glada, you tried talking about that, how it's a much complex system. Even IEA has done many modeling and others. And in my opinion, that I think, yes, we will in a longer term, if we have to, let's say, run steel industry or the cement industry and a lot of petchem industry. So even if we reduce the uses, and let's say today we put a hold on to that we are not going to build anything new, it's still to replace the existing need, and just in case of India, 400 gigawatts, if we have to do it in a decentralized manner, I don't think that will happen in a time and a scale which one would look at. So yes, we will need maybe not 5,000 megawatts of solar park, but we will need others. But where do we do it? And I think the answer is there in this question, that these mines and the carbon sinks which we have created, which are not being utilized, why not we use there? You already destroyed the land by putting you have destroyed the land. So why not try and use that for something else? So there is a lot of mines which are there and we are not using that. Similarly, a lot of infrastructure which is lying unutilized. Can we use that land and other things? And there you build your big solar parks if you want to build on. That's one way of looking at it. And this is one of the arguments we have been making in our movement. We said the 500 gigawatt, which I said earlier, 500 gigawatt of thermal power, which was canceled at different stages, of which many power plants, they had acquired the land. The land is still lying fallow with the government. Communities are saying, give back our land because you're not using it. You are not giving it back. So at least can you please use it for the existing requirement rather than again acquiring more land? So I think
just to come back on, I think on this particular point, I think the question is about that this is land which people used to use in traditional ways, and they're now being told that they can't use it in traditional ways, that it's kind of seen no longer as acceptable to cut bog, cut peat for burning and so on. And so even though it's not a sort of physical displacement, it's a way of life that's been removed because of the judgment that is not kind of a good environmental use of the land. Kathy, did you want to come in on this? So it's related to what you said, Madhuresh, but I think it's quite a specific point.
I was just going to comment, and in here I'm not talking about my book or my personal point of view, but I think the kind of argument that gets made on this, and I think Madhuresh is exactly right with where he started. He said, this is not a just transition. But the kind of discourse that I think leads to these sorts of situations is a discourse that starts talking about things like planetary boundaries, that we're in a context of very real physical limits to what we can do, that we're in an urgent situation where, I mean, this is all rhetoric, right? But it's very much a powerful way of talking about climate change, which is about the need to simply, at this point, place the needs of our atmospheric system and the needs of the global climate system and the needs of other species, even over the needs of particular human beings. And that's not just. On the other hand, it is the other side of the argument. So, and maybe just kind of circling around to sort of like what we're doing here this evening, I think there are many cases in which we can really seek to have just kinds of transition, but for at least some set of actors who are really concerned with climate change, the climate change issue is so serious that it justifies taking actions that may be unjust to particular groups of people in this place and time, in the name of sort of this wider global interest. And then I think the standard response to that is to say, well, you can make those arguments, but yet why is it that it's always particular kinds of people who are asked to make those sacrifices? Because why isn't it Jeff Bezos, who emitted more emissions than most countries in one trip into space? Why isn't he the one being like put in a room somewhere and his money taken away from him? Because we have power at the base of it. And so I think there's a reasonable response even to people who make those kinds of arguments about the urgency of climate action. It's like, well, let's have urgent climate action, but let's not target the same people who are already marginal and dispossessed people all the time. Let's target the powerful. But of course, that's really hard to do.
I'll just add one line to that. I think that's exactly what I was going to say, that I think the question is, who needs just transition? Is it the people, Aboriginal people in Australia's place, do they really need just transition, or is it the rich and the US and the developed countries need the just transition? So those who need, can they think of paying the price for it, which means reduction in the demand rather than keeping to supply and all? So I think that's all I wanted. Who needs the just transition?
Thank you very much. Yes, a very good note to end on, I think. A fascinating discussion. Thank you all so much. It's been a great and very educational experience for me, and I hope for all of you who've been listening. So very many thanks to Kathryn Hochstetler, Madhuresh Kumar, and Glada Lahn. And thanks to all of you who joined us, and those who asked questions, but also those who just listened and didn't ask questions. And thank you also to the Beacon Journal, and very much to the Department of Social Policy's Green Impact team for organising this event. Thank you very much, Michaela. I think it's a great event to organise, and appreciate you doing it. I hope all of you have a lovely rest of evening, and thank you very much for joining us, and good night.
Thank you very much.